Well, joining us again is Tom Harwood, political correspondent, just before you head off to West Suffolk to find out what Matt Hancock's constituents really think is going on. Very interesting, I thought, earlier, that Andrew Neil made the point, and Deanna disagrees quite strongly with it, but Andrew Neil made the point that by just putting Sajid Javid back in the cabinet, avoiding the need for a big reshuffle, actually a government that is pretty stalled in many areas has perhaps, in a funny sort of way, lost an opportunity. Now, I'm assuming that what government ministers this morning are doing is saying that continuity is what we need during the pandemic.
Yeah, I think this is all about damage limitation. This is someone who is a safe pair of hands who's run umpteen departments in the past. He was the first 2010 intake MP to become a cabinet minister at the business department back in the day and has gone through, I think it is 7 departments now that he's been in charge of. And that sort of safe pair of hands means that you can have this continuity. But also, I think we're all expecting a reshuffle later in the summer. And Boris Johnson did not want his plans to be interrupted with a huge and quite messy reshuffle, especially in a week leading up to a by-election, because we all know that some of Boris Johnson's reshuffles in the past have got quite messy. We'll remember he offered Jeremy Hunt the Defence Secretary position, a demotion from Foreign Secretary, and that meant that he walked completely, and that reshuffle took many more days than he was expecting. What Boris Johnson does not want now is people to get antsy, is for this reshuffle to, rather than be a quick replacement, to drag on for days and days and days. That would be a very, very bad look.
But this argument fascinates me. The argument that he's been through 7 different departments, therefore he's a safe pair of hands. I mean, it could well be that he was so hopeless that he kept getting moved on. And
Nigel, I wouldn't have thought that you'd agree with Dominic Cummings so readily.
I'm just about to raise this point. You know, there isn't a lot that Cummings and I agree on, although my big fallouts with him tended to be over style, you know, and what I felt was this sort of very aggressive character. But Deanna, whatever we think of Dominic Cummings as a person, don't some of his criticisms hit pretty near the mark? And in particular, he makes the point that actually Sajid Javid isn't much cop, and that's why he keeps getting moved on.
Well, I think I disagree with that. I mean, I think Sajid is, again, a very, very strong, safe pair of hands, as has been said many times. It's not a line I've been told to repeat. It's just genuinely what I think.
Believe you. I do believe you, honestly.
But no, I think we need to leave him settle into the role, and then people will make their own judgments. But I don't think it's a case of him, you know, being moved on because, in your words, he's hopeless. I think it's been
Dominic Cummings is. I haven't called him hopeless.
Dominic Cummings' words.
No.
I don't think
and Matt Hancock was called worse, of course, by the Prime Minister allegedly.
I certainly don't think that's the case. I think, you know, he was moved from departments in promotions, eventually made it to one of the very top jobs as Chancellor. So I'm really glad that he's actually back in cabinet now. And I really wish him luck in what is going to be a pretty difficult job for the months ahead. Yeah,
Paul, you raised the argument earlier about John Reid, who I think had 8 separate cabinet jobs in the space of 10 years. I mean, this argument that we're getting today, that, you know, being moved on from department to department is somehow a good thing. I mean, it seems to me that if you're there for less than a year, you can barely get your feet under the table, understand the brief before doing the job. This isn't really how government should work, is it?
No, I tend to agree. You don't want a situation where ministers are very kind of transient, they come and go, they're not there long enough to stamp their authority on the department. I think that can be quite disruptive. But, you know, I'm a great believer in the Tony Benn adage that, you know, it's not about personalities, it's about the issues. It's not about which individuals are in which particular positions. I think, you know, the man on the Clapham omnibus and the woman in the dog and duck are less interested about that kind of intrigue than they are about the broader issues of government. And I think most people will be looking at this and thinking, OK, well, Javid's been brought in, but what is going to happen in terms of my wages? What's going to happen in terms of my job? What's going to happen in terms of the National Health Service? When we come out of COVID, what's the economic narrative going to be? Are we going to see an increase in the gap between rich and poor? You know, what's happening in my community in terms of law and order? So obviously it matters who is a particular minister in a particular department, but equally we shouldn't be sidetracked into thinking that these things are, in the long run, particularly important in the public's mind. I don't think they are.
Impossible job. I mean, we know there's a by-election coming up on Thursday, which, you know, in Batley and Spen, which could be a very important by-election. Certainly Keir Starmer will be looking very, very closely to that result. Do you think politics settles down over the next couple of days? or not?
I think it's a brave person who makes a prediction of politics settling down. I mean, do you remember, just as we sort of finally left the European Union at the start of 2020, and we thought, you know what, everyone can breathe a sigh of relief, nothing big's going to happen now, we all just get on with normal life, and everything returns to normal. Well, who could have thought that 2 months later, everything would be turned on its head? I don't think that anyone in the early 21st century could ever say that this is the end of history. I think we've made this mistake too many times before.
Tom Harwood, thank you. Have a great trip to Suffolk.
And delighted to say that Tom is joining me now from Newmarket, which is Matt Hancock's constituency, and there he is. I want to know what they're making of it in the constituency as well, but first of all, tell us a wee bit about this freedom of information request that we've made.
That's right, we've submitted a Freedom of Information request just an hour or so ago to the Department of Health and Social Care. Now, this is to determine exactly what are the security arrangements within the Department for Health, because we've seen this footage, this really intimate footage, appear from within a cabinet minister's office and end up on the front page of a national newspaper. We want to know who had access to that footage, who was dealing with the CCTV. We want to make sure that this is not an endemic problem within government. We want to find out the bottom of what really becoming very serious security questions. Matt Hancock may have resigned, but this story is only just beginning. If people from the top of government can have their private offices accessed by people who really quite obviously don't like them and are willing to sell that sort of footage to newspapers, could that be being sold to nefarious state actors, for example? This is a really serious question, and that's why we've submitted our FOI today.
All right. Secondly, we know that there was a constituency meeting on Friday in Newmarket, and you and I are addicted to all of this stuff, but just to make it clear to folk kind enough to listen to our conversation here on GB News, Matt Hancock, who in the past has been Culture Secretary, he's been a business minister, all sorts of stuff, was the Health Secretary, is no longer the Health Secretary, but from start to finish, I think 2010 to now, he is the Member of Parliament for where you are right now, and that he remains. Are they getting cross, angry or understanding of their Member of Parliament there?
Do you know what? I've had the opportunity to speak to a few people here in Newmarket, the outer edge of his West Suffolk constituency today, and there's a mixed feeling. I mean, not many people are that sympathetic. I spoke to one lady a little bit earlier who was very sympathetic but understood that he had to resign. Other people who didn't vote for him, didn't like him in the first place and think that he's a bit of a scoundrel. And then there were a couple of people actually who were more sympathetic to him before this happened and now their opinion of him has turned completely south. It's fair to say there is not much love for Matt Hancock in his constituency this afternoon.
And we know that there's this thing called recall, and Zach Goldsmith was all over getting that pushed forward, and it was rejected, and now it is there. That if enough members of that constituency sign a petition, then Matt Hancock potentially could be in very serious trouble.
Well, only if he commits a criminal act. What Zach Goldsmith's bill for recall was never actually implemented in full. The version of recall that managed to make it into law has very specific conditions attached to it. People have to be suspended from the House for a certain number of days before a recall petition can be started, or indeed have committed a criminal offence before a recall petition can be started. Now, Matt Hancock has not met any of those conditions for the moment. We know that the Labour Party is calling on a more criminal investigation to take place with regard to breaching coronavirus restrictions. But as things stand, there is no legal basis to start a recall petition.
All right, Tom, thank you very much indeed. That's Tom Harwood there in Newmarket, which is Matt Hancock's constituency. Joining me again now live for a very quick final take on what's going on, our political correspondent, Tom Harwood. Fabricant digging deeper and deeper into what is essentially your story.
Absolutely. I think that this is the question that people across the country are asking. This is really the nub of the issue. Matt Hancock's gone. The sort of moral questions and the hypocrisy questions around what he did seem to have been relatively settled in the minds of people around the country. What isn't settled is how did this footage get about? Could it possibly happen again? And these are the real security questions that people are now wondering. I have to say, I'm in Newmarket right now, and there is not much love for Matt Hancock. Just about everyone I've spoken to has said that he was right to resign, many on the hypocrisy grounds, actually some on the moral grounds as well. Just the fact of the act itself rather than the context being enough for some people I've spoken to here today. But we're trying to move the story on now. We want to look forward, not back. And hopefully asking these questions, we will be able to receive answers both from the department, from us, and Michael Fabricant asking those questions to Parliament as well. We'll hopefully get some answers for the British people.
Well, thank you, Tom. We've had many answers from the British people, and it's pretty well evenly divided at the moment. And Tom knows better than anybody else that the pollsters in number 10 Downing Street will be watching it like eagles. So will GB News. But that is it from me for today. I'm Alistair Stewart, and what a pleasure the last 3 hours have been.
And I want to bring in our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, who joins us now from Suffolk West. That is, of course, Matt Hancock's constituency. And Tom, lots of questions around the CCTV footage that the former Health Secretary was actually captured on. How was that footage procured, potentially in a big security breach?
Well, that's right. We don't know for sure even if this is CCTV footage or hidden camera footage. Yesterday in the papers, Matt Hancock's allies were seemingly suggesting that this was a hidden camera, and yet today we are leaning more towards the CCTV theory. The fact is there are so many unanswered questions that we need a proper investigation. And this is what the GB News Freedom of Information request is all about. We're looking to understand who had access to CCTV in that building, who ran CCTV in that building, how aware ministers are of the security around their buildings and their offices, because after all, if the front page of The Sun can display what's going on inside a senior cabinet minister's office, who else could access a senior cabinet minister's office? What other security implications are there to this? Because, of course, we know that there's been an enormous scandal here. We know that the country has been outraged by the conduct of the Health Secretary. We know that he's resigned, and I'm standing here in his constituency today, and I'll tell you this, there's not much love for him here at the moment. But here at GB News, we want to look forward to the future, not just back to the past. And so we want to see what are the consequences of this apparent enormous security breach. Who else could be under threat? Who else could be looking at other cabinet ministers and what they get up to in private in their offices? These are the real questions that we really need to see answered.
OK, Tom, thank you very much. Well, let us know if you have any updates on that.
Well, our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, is here with me in the studio. There was some suggestion when Sajid Javid got the gig, Tom, that he might try and draw forward the deadline for Freedom Day. He's not done it. But there is a feeling abroad, isn't there, that the Cavaliers have got their man in at the expense of the Puritans. Is that fair?
I think there's certainly a sense of that. However, I would put some caution on that date. You know, the 5th of July being that cut-off date, that break clause moment, the 2-week delay. I think that most Conservative MPs, or at least the ones that I've spoken to in the last couple of days, sort of feel that that was a bit of a sop to them that would never, ever have actually been implemented, just to make sure that there was less of a rebellion over this extension of Freedom Day than otherwise there would have been. But I think certainly there is a sense that within Cabinet, and particularly within those sub-Cabinet meetings that you get between senior ministers who decide this, there is someone who's seen to be not just on the less absolutist side of lockdown, but also more conscious about the economy. Someone who's obviously a former Chancellor, seen as being on the more Thatcherite side of the party, whereas Matt Hancock was obviously more of a Cameroon. I think that there's been a shift there in many directions.
But Tom, this idea that Sajid Javid could, swoop into the Department of Health and with the stroke of a pen suddenly advance the schedule for the Freedom Day arriving, it's absurd. There's a huge amount of institutional inertia that goes with these huge departments, biggest employer, the NHS in Europe, I think I'm right in saying. And the idea he could suddenly, within 24 hours, advance that schedule was clearly wrong-headed.
Yeah, and I don't think that there's a particular impetus to do so, even from Sajid Javid. One of the things he said earlier in the Commons was that 4-week delay will allow 2/3 of adults in this country to have both of their jabs. Now, that's an enormous weapon that we have, as the strategy of the Department of Health has been to move the heavy lifting away from blunt restrictions, which are obviously very, very damaging in so many ways, socially and economically, in favour of jabs that can do the heavy lifting in terms of keeping the disease down. Now, we know that the Delta Indian variant is less effective against one jab, or one jab is less effective against it, I should say, and 2 jabs work so much better. So that time to allow 2/3 of adults to be double jabbed will pay dividends and hopefully make that irreversible roadmap step, because this is the point, and I think this is the deeply political point about this. The government seems to have broad support from the public about going a little bit more slowly down this roadmap. I think where they might lose support, or at least many, many questions will start to be asked of this government, is if they had to go backwards rather than forwards more slowly.
And what about Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock? What did you make of the Prime Minister saying, actually, he was sort of asked to leave?
I think that it's quite a stretch to suggest that the Prime Minister acted particularly decisively here. We heard that on Friday the Prime Minister said that the case was closed. The matter was closed, he'd accepted the apology and we're moving on. By Saturday, the Health Secretary was out, and by Sunday, the Prime Minister appeared to be saying, or at least briefing, that was all his grand plan. The story broke on the Friday and the Health Secretary was gone by the Saturday. But I think it's fair to say this was not a moment of incredible decisiveness from the Prime Minister. This was a moment of, yet again, a lot of pressure being placed on him, a lot of private conversations from members of Parliament, and eventually that pressure reaching a boiling point.
Almost out of time, Tom. In a word, is there any way back ever for Matt Hancock? There's, politics, a day is a long time, a week is a long time in politics, but the weight of public opprobrium on Matt Hancock just feels so great that the idea of him making a return to frontline politics is unconscionable, isn't it?
Well, I think in the middle of the storm, it's always hard to make predictions like this. I was in his constituency yesterday, and there is very little love for Matt Hancock amongst his own constituents. And even those who seem to have voted for him think it's the right decision for him to have stepped down. The Prime Minister was very clear in his response to his resignation that he hopes to see Matt Hancock back in public life in some form, but I think it's just too early to say whether that will materialise or not.
Tom Harwood, thanks a lot, Tom.